First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for your remarks. Raised a number of different questions, obviously, regarding the work of African-American literature in general, African-American poetry. But one of the issues that, as I was thinking about that, didn't come up, and I'd like for the panelists to think about this. Now, this is interesting because since I was a panelist, am I directing this question to me, to myself, to Lauri? Anyway,
Yes.
The issue of gender and sexual orientation, I mean, Duriel referred to it obliquely in the beginning of her talk, but I would like to add that to the factor too, in terms of this question in the university, how that plays a role or doesn't play a role.
Is your question intersectional? Are you talking about races and
with gender?
Yeah, intersectional in that sense. Like what, how does that play a role in this question?
I'll make a very quick comment in that regard. As someone who's taught in every kind of university you can teach in, except community college. I actually got turned down for a job by the community college where Dr. Jill Biden now teaches. But anyway, most of you who are in English departments know that there's been a tremendous development in gender studies, queer theory, and so forth and so on. And over on the creative writing side, we see a great deal of exposure given to LGBTQ poets. But that intersection seems kind of weird in that I don't see in literature programs a lot of attention to poetics in this regard, and I'm not sure why, given the prevalence of queer theory in literary studies and given the preeminence of several queer poets in the creative writing circles, I'm not sure why those things don't come together more often, at least in my experience.
Well, yeah, I was, I was thinking about that, and that was something I was already going on, so I didn't want to go on too long, but it's definitely something that is really something that I see and am very much interested in. And so we're focusing on that for a forthcoming issue of Obsidian, and looking at the relationship between the work of, like inhabiting being bodies and having these experiences, right? LGBTQIA Black folks writing and being positioned to have to contend with even more basically innovative necessity, because there's even less space, right? And so there's even more that has to be opened, more that has to be disrupted. Some of that having to do with one's own family, right? And so we could talk about this from many different kind of vantage points, whether it has to do with somebody having to come out all the time, you have that having to come out all the time because they're not quote unquote read as being LGBTQIA, and then just the incredible richness in what it is to be manifest in any of those different identities, because that's a whole bunch of different folks, and some of that stuff is gender and some of it is not, so if we kind of, when we put all that stuff together, we sometimes don't recognize the tremendous diversity that's there, that's just kind of represented by those letters. But yeah, it's kind of like this, the increasing kind of smallness in my experience of folks who are prepared to recognize just how crazy it is, whatever you're dealing with, right? So it's kind of like, the matrices of meaning with which you contend, negotiating the world with these multiple kinds of identities, including disability, right? And people only getting a portion of it, right? Where they're like, oh, I get the Black part.
Right.
You know what I mean? I get the Black part, but I don't get like, or I get the queer part, or I get the genderqueer part, or I get the, but not, you know, all of that coming together in its dynamics, and that being lost on folks.
Yeah,
In that
that's
sense that there's a certain amount to be spread around. There's a certain limited quantity
Like, you mean of resources?
of attention,
Mm.
and then attention
Of
connects
attention
to
as a resource.
resources.
Mm.
We took care of this. Is that enough?
Right. We can't take, look, you a lot. You know what I mean? You're a lot. We can't take care of all of that. But, but you know, but part of the thing that can be so frustrating, particularly when we're talking about, you know, I live in Chicago, but I teach in Central Illinois, just the kind of, what folks have to negotiate as bodies in those spaces, right? Where you have this kind of emboldened, the good old boys are emboldened, right? The racism, the violence, right? That is just the terrorism of the everyday, and the cost that people have to try to endure. Just not, we're not even talking about doing anything.
right. Yeah, I think about well, two things. One, just my reference yesterday, my talk to the experience of trying to teach Audre Lorde to African American women in Cincinnati, and the very negative reaction that I got from them about her. Which, as you said, I mean, they could accept the Black part, but not the rest, and so forth. And it reminds me of you know, the experiences that Ronaldo described, some of the tapes that he's made and some of the work he's doing now, some of the things he's going through, just living, you know, in California, and what that means about the, you know, precarity of his body, you know, never mind anything else, but just his body. So those are things that I definitely think about in that regard.
You know,
Go ahead,
when I was doing this forensic thing, I was kind of not only shocked at the you know, the racial imbalance, but the gender imbalance of dissertations in this realm of, you know, we're supposed to be somewhere past post-feminist or something like that, right? Marianne Moore, they've done 84 dissertations have passed through the authorities since 1956 on Marianne Moore. I mean, these are not dissertations that just include them. These are ones that have their names on the title. So I just want to make sure that the limitation is clear. Emily Dickinson's 379 dissertations since 1931. So, you know, those are the extremes, or some extremes. But Elizabeth Bishop has had 114. So the point of thinking about where we are or where we want to be, and the different distance between the two places, is something we should keep in mind, because there's something about the discourse of the university that tells us we've arrived when the place we want to arrive at is still somewhere over the horizon.
I might add something, since Geoffrey's done this great research on dissertations. Those of us who advise dissertators know that we often have to advise people against doing a single author dissertation anymore, because of the difficulty of getting it published and the problems it presents on the job market. But that seems to fall away if you're talking about certain prominent white writers. I mean, it may still be a problem, but it's clearly not as big a problem. I can imagine the difficulty someone might confront if they wanted to do an entire dissertation on Georgia Douglas Johnson. Or, well, even better, there's several great chapters about Ann Spencer now. You know, many of you know Evie Shockley's chapter in her book, and There's several new articles on Ann Spencer just recently. And, you know, she fits all the categories of the publishers want. She's doing this tremendous nature work, environmental work. She's part of the Harlem Renaissance. But what would happen to someone who decided to do an entire dissertation just on Ann Spencer?
And Carlene Ferrari, who's speaking in our next panel, did her dissertation on Ann Spencer. So it'll be very interesting to hear her perspective next.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's okay. No, that's good. That's good, Lauri. So we got about
And she's got a job.
She's got a job. So I guess we've got maybe time for one more roundabout, as it were. So, you know, and this is I know this is a problem that applies to so many different things, but thinking about the question that Geoffrey asked about, you know, the single author phenomena. So how do you get around, maybe you don't get around, how do you negotiate the question of tokenism? I don't mean in terms of hiring practices, but I mean even in terms of what do you teach within the limits of, you know, the semester? How do you expose students to certain writers without falling into, especially writers that are not well known, writers of color and so forth, without falling into the trap of tokenism?
Such a great question. Well, my response is screw it. I mean, that's the example is what I did with the Visiting Writers series. I really didn't go for what might have been thought of as identity politics balance. I think you do what you're drawn to do. That, to me, that's what this whole colloquia has been about, is figuring out how we can do what we believe is the right thing to do without playing into things like tokenism or the political politics of the neoliberal university that we terminology we've been using and what we feel we're surrounded by. You know, instead of fighting against tokenism, I found it more effective to ignore tokenism.
Again, getting back to dissertations, there's a kind of tokenism in dissertations these days where people will include like one chapter on a Black writer. You know,
Right.
I had a PhD student a few years ago who did the reverse. It was one chapter on a white writer, and she's the one who doesn't have a job yet.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would just say that part of the freedom that I have, I think, in teaching is, is teaching as a part of a creative writing program, right? And so that, and sometimes it's not freedom, it's like absolute containment, because the expectation from some undergraduates in particular is, why are we reading literature? Why are we reading literature? Aren't we just supposed to be writing creative stuff? And it's like, okay, yeah, don't you need to read something? So that's always interesting, but particularly when I'm working with graduate students, that positions me to be able to follow my own, as Lauri says, like, what it is that kind of lights you up, what it is that gets your cylinders firing so that you can really be enthusiastic in the classroom and also give them some of that enthusiasm. The thing that I find too is just, the less is more ends up being really important to recognize, because when you have this kind of real complexity and you're pushing open some spaces, it puts you in the position of having to give more, more resources, more reading that they haven't met, more, more different kinds of things that they haven't seen before. Like, you can't make the assumption that they have any idea what you're talking about.
Right.
So then you have to bring everything. You have to bring all of the different pieces of the critical apparatus in order to give them some kind of ground to stand on, because otherwise, because they haven't received it anywhere.
Right.
One of the things I think is, in some ways, an inheritance we have is that, especially when we're teaching Black literature, is it's almost overdetermined as a historicist project. And I found that one way around that has to do with a focus on formal questions, for questions of form, when we're talking about, as we do with all writing, right? But when you do it with Black writing by Black authors, it sort of breaks open a shell in a way, because people don't always expect it. You know, they're looking for you to basically explain only just to limit yourself to the historical and the sociological. And if the formal is yoked, if you will, to the historical, then it becomes a whole different thing, because then when you go talking about white writers, where of course the historical is presumed not to exist or to be marginal, then you have, in some way you have a better tool to work to work with both. But also the question I think that you raise, Tyrone, goes to the question of canonicity too, like the wedge in for Black and other writers of color has been historicism and sociological issues, socioeconomic issues. And, the idea of the formal innovation in poetics has always been sort of, I wouldn't even call it taken for granted, but just not taken at all. And, this is I think, as I said earlier, the question is not quantity or quality. The question is social equality. The answer is social equality. And so, I think finding ways of, liquidating the tokenist thing, by the way we focus on what we teach, I think is one way to go.
Okay,
Lauri?
Tyrone, we're starting to get some
that's what I was about to say.
I just want to make clear to everybody, these questions are kind of long, but I want to make clear to everybody, we're looking both in the Q&A and in the chat. So you can ask your question in whichever place you are in. Tyrone, can you see the one from Lauren Russell? I think that was the first one.
You want me to read that one?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a question from Lauren. Can someone speak to how it might be different for a white or white appearing person to happen to invite all Black writers for a reading series than for a Black person to make the same curatorial choices? I remember being accused of being biased toward the African-American experience in student evaluations for teaching maybe more than 25% Black writers. So I can, first of all, I can confirm that experience, Lauren. And I'm sure other people can too, that on my evaluations in my general lit courses, if I teach, this has happened to others, I'm sure, if I teach, say, 2 Black writers or 2 writers of color, amongst, let's say, 8 writers, my students' evaluation will say that we certainly read a lot of Black writers this semester. So this is a phenomenon, I think, that is fairly widespread.
You had the same thing?
Yeah, where there's a kind of there's an assumption. I've had to. It depends. It depends on the level that I'm teaching at. Usually, when I'm teaching graduate students, and if I'm teaching creative writing, there's a different kind of trust, right, of me, and a different kind of, I think, relationship to my work and what it is that I bring. And so they want that. Whereas then you have other students who are like, oh no, oh no, which is part of the reason we don't have like a lot of, it's hard at my institution for an African-American literature course to make, and I remember teaching a feminist theory course that was focusing on Black feminism and having some students drop and having other students say, well, I need to take the course again. I need to take the feminist theory course again.
Right.
I need to take a different feminist theory course because that one was so Black.
I don't want us. Sorry, Aldon. I don't want us to forget the other part of Lauren's question, because she did say the difference between a white appearing white or white appearing person, curating a reading series as opposed to a Black person. So that's part of the question too.
Well, that's where I was going to jump in, because as a white appearing person, I actually have invited Lauren Russell to give a poetry reading. But a lot of us are in positions where we don't actually have the opportunities to bring people. I've never been allowed to have any influence on any poetry reading series at any university I've ever taught at, except when I was at Loyola Marymount for a little while. But because I have access to a little bit of research money, I'm able to bring, one or two people a year at each place I've ever been. And because I have so few such opportunities, probably no one's ever going to accuse me of leaning one way or the other, because I only bring two people a year, right? And yet in the classroom, you do run into these same kinds of things. Most of the readings that I've sponsored on my campus are attached to some class, but that's because I want those students to be there so we have at least some audience, right? But clearly, I'm not. The kinds of things that are said to white professors and Black professors are clearly going to be different. Unlike me, no Black professors, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I've been accused of being anti-white because of my teaching, never because of anything I did with regard to readings. I think probably as a white appearing person, actually, I like the terminology that Ellen Julia Cooper uses, someone supposed to be a white person. I don't think I would probably ever get that in regards to poetry. Our poetry series at Penn State tend to be more segregated regarding to aesthetics than to race and ethnicity. And I think that may be true a lot of other places too. We also have Charles actually has a quite long comment that's worth looking at, but we also have
Could I just very quickly hop on to that last question as a white appearing female person, because I think that this is where we can also call on that intersection of race and gender and pedagogy. It's a complicated stew. I'm not aware of ever having been criticized for teaching African-American literature or having a heavy preponderance of African-American writers. The issue has been more impressions of racial sameness, which I think is kind of irrelevant to me as the professor. I think it's much more about the curriculum, about the content, about what they're being exposed to. And that's the resistance that we sometimes feel in students. We talked about trigger warnings yesterday. Sometimes students feel that they are entitled to have a certain amount of control over what it is they're exposed to. And that's where I think it's been an issue for me, not so much who I am or what I'm offering, but what they feel they ought to be exposed to. I just wanted to hop on with that before we go into Charles.
Well, just one brief thing in terms of white appearing person. I always keep in mind that racial categories in the United States began as a matter of law. So I always think about it in terms of legally designated white person and legally designated, person, Black person or whatever, because all the definitions have their origins in American law.
That's a really important point. But then that's also experiential, of course. And that's where somebody like Ken Warren becomes problematical, and the idea of post-racialism. And I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to speak on this panel with beloved and distinguished colleagues. I think we've opened up an awful lot to talk about.
Hey, Aldon, do you want to take Charles' question?
Well, actually, what I was going to say is Charles has got a great point, but it's not got a question mark in it.
Right.
So maybe we only have about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to actually conjoin two entirely disparate things. Although I think we're also clever, we can bring them together. Charles is talking about the very interesting thing that I think all of us have wound up finding ourselves doing, which is going to off-campus venues and so forth to be able to do some of the work that we want to do that might be more difficult or might attract a smaller audience on the campus. I know Lauri's done that. I know Duriel's done that. I've done that. Probably all of us have done that. I think we could probably connect it. David Birdie actually has a question that's even got the virtue of being short. Since academia is an instrument to reproduce middle-class behavior, how do you think race intersects with class? I think there is a relationship between these two questions. So have at it, guys. Anybody?
Oh. Well, Xavier University, where I teach, absolutely draws, for the most part, middle-class students, upper middle-class students of all races and ethnicities. And so that's a challenge in and of itself, because on some levels, there's, you know, at least up until, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years. Now, 2020 has changed things, obviously, in terms of the mindset of some of the students, Black and white on campus, not only around issues of race, but around issues of class. So they become much more conscious of those issues, you know, because of 2020. But prior to that, I would say that there's no question that, you know, the university, the private liberal arts university I teach at, absolutely, it was all about reproducing the status quo.
You know, I would connect this to the discussions we had the first 2 days. I mentioned that I went to what was essentially an open admissions, $0 to $10 tuition community college, federal, well, not community college in the classical sense, but it was a 4-year liberal arts college, now the University of the District of Columbia. And people from New York were talking about the same kind of issues, that these opportunities were made available to us when folks my age were young, and they've been steadily withdrawn ever since. And there is both a racial and a class component to that. What I notice over and over again with regard to graduate school in particular is that it's almost impossible for anyone to get a graduate degree in English now who has to work full-time, because they don't make classes at night available at most places and so forth. You can't, I was never able to be a TA, for example, because I had a job. So I'm just going to throw that in the mix, and then I'm going to jump over to, since our massive IT team behind the scenes.
Can I say something?
Yeah, just a second, Duriel. I was going to announce our massive IT team of hundreds of people working on the computer behind the scenes have told us we can go 5 minutes over. So we'll hear from Duriel, and then we'll go to John Keen's question.
Okay. Yeah, we got a great question from John Keen.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as that relationship to class, you know, one of the things that, you know, I didn't say because I was going on so long was that, you know, what are our expectations? Like how we get free. The university is another version of the master's house. University is another version of master's house, right? So I'm thinking about, well, what are recommendations and thoughts for the future? Different models of engagement, co-creation, and improvisation via how? Like, what is this kind of return? For me, it's to art making as sustenance and relation, to this poetics of sustento, this poetics of witness, this poetics of play, of transgression and subversion, right? And I think that part of it, you know, too, like that reality of not being able to work full time, and that you brought up, Aldon, not being able to work full time and get the degree, is that that's difficult in any circumstance, but it's particularly difficult if whatever it is that you know, the subsidy that you're getting from the institution is requiring that you also work full time, right? So it's like you're working full time outside this school, then they want you to work. If you were going to be a TA, they want you to teach 2 classes, which is really full time work. Yeah. And where is the time for you to think? Where is the time for you to consider the things that you have been reading? And you need sustenance to be able to do that, other kinds of sustenance, other kinds of resources. And then that kind of pushback that comes from the institution that says, well, you know, we think that's important. However, there is no line item in the budget for that. And you continue to make the budget request, and they continue to look at it and ignore it or clap for you before making it, you know, and then go on about, you know, that status quo.
I think Duriel knows what I learned on the job, which is the place to do that thinking is when you're supposed to be doing your real job. I want to get to John Keen's question here, though. And this gives me the perfect opportunity to point out there was a special section on the work of John Keane in an earlier edition, I think it was just the most recent edition before this one, of the aforementioned journal. John Keane says, Duriel did broach the issue of race extending beyond the black-white binary. So might we hear about how these issues connect in terms of the university with the experiences of other BIPOC faculty? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, by the way, by BIPOC. Students and staff, particularly at a moment of rising global white nationalism, domestic white supremacist and fascist terrorism, and evident anti-Asian American racism, in particular in the US. So again, 55 questions there, but they're all cogent. Dorothy has got a comment over in the chat too. We've got 4 minutes left. I encourage people to go over and look at Dorothy's comment as well.
It's a really good comment.
So getting back to John's question, the experiences of other BIPOC faculty, students, and staff. We haven't talked much about staff yet, for example.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the question brings to mind a course that I've been teaching at Cal Arts on migration and citizenship, which has opened up a whole bunch of doors in terms of how connecting different people's experiences in terms of both lived experience and historical experience. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answers the question, but I do want to just say one brief thing about on the class issue two things. One is that we should remember that there are at least two university systems in the United States. And one of those is taxpayer supported. And that the Thermidorian revolution has taken place probably more vigorously in the taxpayer-supported university sector than in the privately supported university sector. Most notably at City University of New York, but certainly elsewhere too. And I think when we think about that, we tend to, we figure the university student as a middle-class person. But in the publicly funded universities, that's not always the case. And, I know this from my experience teaching at UC Santa Barbara, where I'm, basically dealing with people who are both on the front lines of the Black Lives Matter movement and on the front lines of fighting the pandemic as workers, their parents, their relatives, and so on. So I think being mindful of that is a useful thing.
I think that's such a great point. My students have hunger precarity. They are taking care of family members. They are working multiple jobs that they must work during the time of pandemic. This is far from a privileged student body, and they are the ones who are being told it is not in the curricular or structural needs of faculty or staff or students to offer them a single course in African American literature. So we have quite a significant disconnect. So I like reminding that we must bring class and race back into the center of what it is that we're doing. And there's a lot of pushback from even public universities that are intended to serve precisely this diverse student population. I mean, faculty does not represent also anything like the student body.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like part of it is really, it's just, what is the university as an arm? Like, what is its interest, right? What is in the interest of the university?
Administration, self-perpetuation, right? Every time you turn around, there's a new assistant vice president of some wing that you never knew you needed or never existed before.
So a true analysis, right, that brings together the ways in which all of these oppressions are linked, works against the work of the university.
Bingo.
Come on, let's tell the truth.
That's right. Yeah,
and
look, so, Julie Patton says real estate.
Let's keep the little people, let's keep them separate. Let's not let them see the relationships between all of these things, because if they do, they will no longer be docile bodies. They will no longer accept that which it is we are dishing to them.
No, it's self-perpetuation. Remember back in the day when administrators used to be us, used to be colleagues who had the bad fortune to have to serve for a year or two doing administrative work, and then they would scurry back to the departments and do the work of the university again. You know, I'm talking about, you know, for those of us who are old enough to remember, now it is a professional class of people who are not educators. They're not in tune with the student experience. They're not educated. They just keep the machine going.
Yeah.
We're in our last 8 seconds. I want to connect the end of Dorothy's comment to the earlier question about tokenism. She's talking about the necessity of making these issues the center of courses, not just an add-on, not a separate course, not an anthology and so forth. And I think Duriel gave us the perfect end point for exactly that. As someone who grew up in the Baptist church, I'll remind people it was Samson inside the temple who brought that motherfucker down. Anyway, now having mentioned bringing motherfuckers down, I think it's time for our break. How's that for a segue?
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone.